Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for organizing the first annual. I will be here next year. I will push hard for there to be a second annual Ed Talks here at the Ed School. So what I'm going to talk about today, TED Talks are supposed to be about one idea. And so the kind of umbrella I'm going to use today is what it would take to move from a 20th to a 21st century education system. That we're 13 years into the 21st century. Maybe we should start talking about a 22nd century education system. But I'm going to do that by starting with the ground and then working outwards. So the prompt they gave us was, what would I tell future educational leaders? And the first thing I would tell future educational leaders is to think about what they already know. So in my class, one of the first things we do is we just reflect on the best educational experience you had, the moment where you felt like you were inspired, changed, deepened in your thinking, or your life course was changed in some way through something that happened to you in an educational institution. For me, it was history. I had a teacher, Brooks Lakin, Mr. Lakin to us, who taught at the school where I went for 41 years. I once asked him why our AP history class ended in 1961, and he said that was the first year he had started teaching. He was a fantastic teacher. He was the kind of teacher that, with the exception of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which we could have learned more about, he was a fantastic teacher. He was the kind of teacher where you and your friends would get together to study for a test, and you would work, and you would work, and you would work, and you would get from like a B to a B+. It was that kind of a thing. We had to write a history paper, which he gave us on the first day, and he asked us, we asked him how long it should be, and he said the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was 250 words, but none of you are Lincoln, so I think 50 pages would be good. So he set a kind of a standard, which probably none of my students have ever forgiven him for, in terms of what he expected of us. And he also took, for me, history, a discipline which I had seen as a kind of collection of dates, facts, and turned it into this really exciting kind of interpretive enterprise, a place where he asked us basically to take facts, to read essays that historians had written, and to think about how you would bring those together to advance your own interpretations about historical events. And in some ways, I'm still doing that. I'm a social scientist. I gather facts. I make interpretations. I marshal evidence, etc. And it basically all goes back to Mr. Lakin in 10th grade. So schools at their best, this is sort of what schools at their best look like in terms of learning. Schools can also be socially integrative institutions. One of the students referred to the Common School era and the idea that schools are our institution for bringing people together. I remember not in high school, but in college, being in a seminar with two students who were roommates, one whose parents were penniless, who was an immigrant from Samoa, and the other and this guy, like, he would always come in sort of dressed down. And this other guy, like, endlessly, like, is always his polo and his, like, carefully coiffed hair. The other guy was the heir to the Rite Aid fortune, and they were roommates, best friends. And I thought this only really could happen in an educational institution. So schools can be these sort of socially integrative places. And then I also think of schools as places which are sort of rich with respect to the human spirit. Schools are places where we not only learn, but we dance, we do theater, we play sports. Any kind of valuable human activity you can probably find in a school somewhere. So I think of schools as kind of potentially profoundly optimistic places, that more people are enrolling in more kinds of schools than at any point in human history, and that's based in a conviction on their part that essentially they can be something different than who they are today, and that they themselves can be transformed through an educational experience. So the first thing I would say to these educational leaders is think from what you know of what schools can be. Then the second thing I would tell them is to go visit some schools today, where you can see these things in pockets. You see many dedicated and skilled teachers, and you see some exceptional schools. But at the level of the system, you don't really see, particularly on two fronts, learning and engagement, what we might hope for from schools. So with respect to learning, some of you, I wrote an op-ed a week or two ago, so I'm trying not to repeat things that were in there for anyone who may have seen it. With respect to student learning, there's been some progress on the National Assessment of Educational Progress in elementary schools, and particularly in math. But in high schools, which presumably should be the accumulation of what happens in earlier years, 17-year-olds still read on the NAEP on average at the same level as they did in 1971, 6 years before I was born. There's still huge gaps by race and class. The average 8th grader scores on these tests, the average white 8th grader scores on these tests in the same place as the average black 12th grader. Particularly distressing to me, having spent a lot of times in schools, is data on student engagement. If you ask students to give you a one-word description of school, the most frequently given response is boring. 70% of high school students say that they are bored on a daily basis. Now, they're high school students, like, maybe some degree of boredom is inevitable. We had a Finnish visitor here yesterday, Pasi Salberg, who only half-jokingly said that the success of his system was that they kept students away from school as long as possible until they were age 7, and only then started them in school. And the other thing about student engagement data is it shows that students are most engaged in the elementary years, and the longer they've spent in school, the less engaged they feel. We've been doing a study of high schools that were chosen because they were committed to deeper learning, ambitious instruction in high schools. But we are finding it is very difficult to find deeper learning with any degree of consistency. A friend of mine, a professor at Michigan, David Cohen, when I told him he was doing this project, said, have you found any yet? There are no incentives to produce deeper learning in our system. And I think that is roughly true. We've seen a little bit of it in AP. We've seen more of it in international baccalaureate classes. So there's some Mr. Lakins out there, but it is the kind of exception and not the norm. Some of the most exciting parts of our studies have been at the margins. Kids seem most intellectually engaged in electives, extracurriculars, things that are not at the core of their academic subjects, in a sense that it's the things that are supposed to be the sort of meat and potatoes where students are staring blankly at PowerPoints and writing down apply and recall kind of answers. And it's at these things which are supposedly at the margins, art, music, electives, extracurriculars, where students are given opportunities to practice, refine skills, work on things over time, where they seem most engaged. So the second thing I would tell these future leaders is to reflect on the gap between what schools can be, schools we have experienced, and what schools often are across the board today. And then the last point, the third thing in the sort of rule of threes, is that I would ask them to think about what it would mean to transform from a system where what I just described was the norm in the second part of the talk to the kind of schools that we've all experienced and teachers that we've experienced at our best in the first part of our talk. Very briefly, I like to say that we have the system that we signed up for. We built a system about a century ago when students weren't going to go on to high school. Most students weren't going to go on to high school, when people thought that the level of training that teachers needed was minimal. Early ed schools put their eggs in training administrators and not in training teachers. Selective institutions trained administrators. Less selective institutions trained teachers. You can still see that today. We heard a little bit of that in Jonathan's comments. And so my argument in this book that's coming out is that essentially we're kind of caught in a kind of downward spiral of the making in the 20th century, that we draw less than our strongest people into teaching. We give them weak or minimal training, which by their own accounts is not that useful. We send them into highly segregated schools with high levels of poverty by international standards. And then when they don't produce, we demand accountability, and we sort of feign surprise that they have not achieved what we asked. And what we want is the kind of the opposite spiral, which characterizes some of the higher performing nations on the PISA, which is essentially the opposite of that, drawing strong people into teaching, giving them extensive preparation, supporting their students outside of school, and giving them time to collaborate, again, as per Jonathan's slides, to develop their practice. So In brief, what we need to do is we need to sort of take this vision of what deeper learning might look like, invert the pyramid, and then start rethinking all of our structures, training, assessment, tenure, evaluation, et cetera, in light of the kinds of schools that we would like to create. And then I guess the last point I would make is that high schools in particular, I think, just need to be redesigned. We're sort of trying to send everybody through a few core subjects, and it's not working that well. So I would urge us to think that schools, even with respect to the academics, there's learning which is disciplinary, but there's also learning which is interdisciplinary, experiential, epistemological. There's learning which is more academic. There's learning which is more hands-on. And we haven't really tapped into any of the sort of range of, consistently across the board, there are pockets. We haven't really tapped into any of the range of things that we could potentially provide for students. If we created this kind of 21st century system in which we put students and their kind of needs, interests, and desires first, I predict that they will surprise us. The best part of visiting schools always is talking to students who are always witty, ironic, penetrating, and have really trenchant observations about what is happening to them. And if we could create a system in which that didn't just happen around the edges but was at the center, it would be a much better world. Thanks.